Hello and welcome to Critical Faculty. I'm your host, Hanny Seylim. Today I've got two of my favorite people on the planet, a scientist and a philosopher. You two, who are actually collaborating for the third time. Who would have known a scientist and a philosopher working together? There is a big debate whether the two disciplines are sort of in cahoots, but this is a conversation for another day. Today we are going to talk about the story of Moses and the Exodus, and there is a book being written as we speak, and the writers, let me introduce Aaron Adair and Jonathan M.S. Pierce, who are going to tell you about what they've done in the past, what are their credentials, and why are they interested in such subjects. We'll go alphabetically. Hello, Aaron.
Hello. Yes. So, my name is Aaron. I am trained as a physicist. I am a research affiliate at MIT. When I'm doing my day job, it's in data science. So what does that happen to do with the Bible? Nothing directly, but along the way, I have recently been saying I self-radicalized myself into biblical studies for the last 20 years. And I'm a member of the Society of Biblical Literature. I have published a few books, book chapters, and articles in biblical studies, so I'm at least qualified enough to talk on subjects like this.
Right. And I am Jonathan M.S. Pierce. I am a philosopher of religion, although I've been more recently embroiled in the world of geopolitics, and I'm a little rusty on my philosophy of religion. But I, and together with my esteemed co-author, we are co-writing this book on the Exodus, which is the third in my trilogy of books. I wrote a book, initially The Nativity, a critical examination, looking at the birth of Jesus, the accounts, and see whether they were historically justifiable. Could you be justified in believing them from a historical point of view? And then you have the resurrection of Jesus, the end of his life, the two bookends to Jesus' life, and as it interacts with history, intersects with history. Are we historically justified, and also theologically justified in believing the resurrection accounts in the Bible? And then the third pillar, which these two kind of sit upon. So it's almost there's a contingency here whereby the Exodus is the foundation to all of this. So if you are a Christian or indeed a Jew, are you justified in believing, about the accounts of Jesus, but then about what Jesus is kind of fulfilling in terms of the Mosaic law, or the story of Moses is the story of the Exodus. This again is another account that intersects with known history. And so we've probably got the three areas of the Bible in those three books. Those three topics that most intersect with history, and therefore we are in the best position to look at these claims with a magnifying glass to see if they actually stand up. We've got benchmarks, and we've got other extra biblical data. The wedding at Cana. There's how can we work out whether that happened or not? There's no kind of intersection with history there. It's just an assertion where it was actually these assertions, if you like, do intersect with history. So that's the basis of these three books, and in fact the third book that we are just sort of putting the finishing touches on at the moment.
Right. I just want to say we are live on YouTube at the moment through StreamYard Studio, but I'm also co-streaming on TikTok. The conversation is going to be focused on around YouTube, but the TikTok viewers, if they can tell me that you can actually hear our voices, because at this point we're using the same sources to stream into the two streams. And so I was wondering if you can hear us on TikTok, if you can write a quick message to let us know that we are truly heard. Now, this conversation about the Exodus, I mean, there were prophets beforehand. Some even Muslims go to the length of going through the genealogy of prophets, including Adam himself. Apparently, the first man ever to walk the earth is a prophet. I'm not sure what kind of message is it, message to self kind of thing, or it's a weird situation. But there are a lineage of prophets preparing the way to the big event, and I guess Moses is one of those really telling stories. It's biblical, if you wish. But before we go into all of that, I want you to lay down the framework of how this is going to look like. What sort of scientific method, if we can call it that, in terms of history, have you used to write this book, and what is the predication? How can you tell that this is a historical event and this is not? This is more likely a fictional, or at least an exaggeration.
I'll let Aaron do the main answer to this in terms of sort of dating and whatnot. But essentially, you want to look at all sorts of different areas. You want to look at contemporaneous cultures, the ancient Near East, what was going on there, what do we understand from then? You know, we have similar sorts of holy books that we completely discount as being anything near true. And yet, for some people, the Bible, it has this... There's a lot of special pleading that goes on that the Bible is true. Okay, well, why are these claims true and these ones aren't? Especially when some of these stories seem to be pretty much the same. We can use archaeology. We can use our understanding of the cultures in which some of these stories existed. Our historical knowledge of Egypt, for example, is kind of necessary to understand what's going on with the Exodus story. And so, you know, just to give you a basis of a quick kind of overview of archaeology, traditionally used to have biblical maximalism, which is the idea that the Bible is just true. This is a presupposition. We presuppose that the Bible is true, and we run these seminaries where we are training these priests and whatever, and we as seminaries are going to pay archaeologists to go out to the ancient Near East, and they are going to do this work that proves what we believe is true. So you start with this benchmark that the Bible is true, and then everything you find in the ground, you have to kind of, you know, it's malleable. You can move it around and you try and fit it into the data that you think is true from the Bible. And then that kind of move towards biblical minimalism, whereby you throw out the Bible and say, actually, we're not going to start with the Bible. We're going to we'll do archaeology. We'll understand history as we've understood it through archaeology and all these other data points. And then we try and work out what we find in the ground in the context of things that we definitely do know, rather than starting with the Bible as truth. And so as you move towards this kind of minimalist approach, you get a very different understanding of what actually took place in this whole area. So so the Bible then looks very different in terms of, you know, are we justified in believing it? Well, previously you started off by believing it, then you went and looked at the evidence to post hoc rationalize that, and then you went back to the Bible and said, see, it's true. Now in a very different place where you've got even people from the area, Israel Finkelstein and others, you know, really changing the domain, and archaeology looks very different to how it used to. And so, you know, when you apply that kind of approach to understanding the Bible, it starts kind of unraveling and yeah. Anyway, I'll let Aaron take over from there.
Aaron, the floor is yours.
Yeah. All right. So I will focus a bit on the methodology of asking, how do we figure out if what this story is, what it might have developed from, how much should we be taking literally, how much are we going to just have to say it's all made up, and even if so, when and how. Now, there's basically extremes on the view you can have, not just even like biblical maximalism, but traditionalist fundamentalism. Everything the Bible says is true, even the parts that contradict the other parts, everything is true. And then, of course, on more minimalism, what can we actually say from primary sources, either records of the actual time that we can pull out of the ground, or what archaeology can tell us? Which of these methods can help pinpoint anything historical from this story? And like I say, the extremes are the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. It obviously happened, and the Bible tells us exactly the timeline of events, and so you know exactly when the event happened, and you just have to know exactly where to dig based on a careful reading of the Bible. And if you don't find anything, it's because you suck at reading. Now, let's start then with the question of, does the Bible even give a consistent message of when this story takes place? In 1 Kings chapter 6, if memory serves, there's a statement that the Temple of Solomon was built so many years after the Israelites left Egypt. And you'd say, well, if we know when the temple is built, and it's, I believe it's in 480 years earlier than that, boom, you have a date for the Exodus. Problem solved. Everything good, right? Except it depends on which manuscript you look at. There is a difference between the Hebrew in the Masoretic text and the Greek translation known as the Septuagint. Now, the difference is only 40 years, but you have to wonder, all right, one, if you're a really hardcore literalist, 40 years is not zero. There is a difference. How do you know which one is the actual word of God or the words of Moses? Or this would actually be after Moses because this is in 1 Kings. But either way, how do we know that this is true? Which of these is true? If it's changed, well, why did it get changed? How do you actually choose which of these two numbers is the same? And the weird thing is, you might say, well, the Hebrew is the original language. We should be going with that. But this is from the Masoretic text, which we only have about from 1,000 years ago. It's basically medieval in its development. If you go with the Septuagint, that is a Greek translation that goes back, at least according to tradition, to the 3rd century BC. It's in paper form or papyrus form. We have copies of, or at least bits of it, from 4th century AD, roughly. So it's definitely older, but it's also nowhere near the time of Moses or the time of Solomon or anything like that. So there's a big time gap. We don't have anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls for this, so we can't decide that way. Now, you might be saying, well, it's just 40 years, right? If you systematically, though, take a look at times in the Greek version and the Hebrew version, you notice, oh, this isn't the only number that's different. They've completely changed the timeline for the creation of the universe by centuries. And it looks like an actual systematic change. So it's okay, these numbers are a little bit funky. Are there any other signs in the Bible about when things take place? And if you then start having it intersect with archaeology, then you really get into trouble. So I'll show two things that show that the Bible isn't quite consistent on when things happen. But John, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just before that, because I think the use of the 480 years there between Solomon's temple and the Exodus accounts is interesting in itself, because, you're trying to always work out what's symbolic and what's literally true. And if you're trying to do history, you're looking at very particular dates and you're trying to be as accurate as possible. But when you do numbers in the Bible, you've got all sorts of symbology going on there. As soon as you've got the 12 tribes of Israel, as soon as you've got 40 years or the number 40, everything is about 12s and 40s, right? And so 480 years, unsurprisingly, is 12 lots of 40, right? And they're in, it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. They're in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days and nights. And so, these numbers are very symbolic. So 480 years is likely schematic and does indeed conflict, I believe, with archaeological evidence on Solomon's reign itself. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah.
I just want to ask, while you're there, in your research, have you found out, what about the Jewish population in Egypt? I mean, we're talking about probably a couple of million, according to Exodus. Has there been any record, while you're reading sort of the records, that what was the Egyptian population anyway to start with? And could it hold 2 million people of the Jewish people?
I will connect that to the other archaeological issue with timing. So at the time of the Exodus, and this would be very broadly, the Bible would put things in the late Bronze Age. That's the general time frame that both the internal chronology would say and some of its other clues would say that this would be the late Bronze Age period. And at that time, when Egypt was basically at its peak power, the country might have held 2 or 3 million people total. And, well, the Exodus story, it actually gives a census multiple times of how many military-aged men left Egypt to go off in the desert for 40 years and then eventually be part of the conquest into the Holy Land. And it tells us, there's actually multiple sources in the Bible as well. Spoiler alert, Moses didn't write it. And one of the sources says it was just roughly 600,000. And then another source says it's exactly this number of people from each of the tribes that totals up to about 600,000. I think it's like 603,000 and change army aged men left. And then you realize, well, that's just the men. They clearly brought women and children with them because 40 years later, you're not going to have too many fighting age men at that point. So, and we also know that the numbers afterwards was a similar number of fighting men when they do finally enter, because the Book of Numbers gives a census twice, the before and the after. And you say, okay, well, if there's 600,000 fighting men, if you just do the most basic estimate and just assume a nuclear family, 1 wife per man, 2 kids, and then you realize, oh, we're talking like 2 or 3 million people. So basically the entire population of Egypt left Egypt, hung around in the desert for a generation, and then entered a country that...
With all the livestock that they would need to take with them as well, of course, and all the supplies. I mean, this train would be... In fact, they're supposed to be wandering around the Kadesh Barnea area for 40 years. And you're like... So wandering around there for 40 years is ridiculous. You're like, if you can't wander yourself out of a desert with that many people, I mean, they can probably... Just all that those people in a line is probably the width of the desert, right? So it's just ridiculous.
Oh, yeah. It's one of the estimates early on by one of the early... critics of the Bible in modern times, Rimaris, he basically does the quick calculation, said, well, if they just walk single file, the first Israelites would be entering the Holy Land before the last one left Egypt if they just walked in a straight line. So it's kind of ridiculous in how large the numbers are and how they could have possibly gotten lost along the way. It's just like, just follow the coast, go single file, the whole group gets there, no problem. Moses, you screwed up.
But I mean, the real takeaway point from analysing the Exodus account is there's literally no evidence of it. I mean, you can maybe look at you could squint your eyes a little bit, but essentially there is zero historical evidence for this. Like, if you can find evidence of Bedouin tribes living contemporaneously in the Kadesh Barnea area, and you can't find evidence of millions of Jewish people, and there's no evidence of the slavery of that many people in Egypt, there's just none of this fits. None of the claims from the Exodus account in the Bible fits with known history and is not confirmed by any extra biblical data in any way, shape, or form. It's just that's your starting point, and it gets worse from there.
Oh yes.
Well, what about the gold? I mean, there's still some gold from Egypt as well, which somehow they managed to melt and create an idol to worship. How did they do that scientifically? How do you do that?
They looked behind the sofa. They found a couple of coins. Just melt them down. Usually.
Yeah. It's actually interesting we bring this up because often there's the claim, it's like, well, we wouldn't expect to find any evidence from these people because if they were like Bedouins, they wouldn't have taken anything that would have been well preserved in the archaeological record. If they just brought sacks to fill with water and all of that is biodegradable, then no wonder it wouldn't last. But it's like, but if they can smelt gold, they apparently have a whole bunch of metallurgical machinery with them. They have swords and spears, and of course, you're going to have to keep those sharp, so you're going to have basically a factory walking around with you in the desert to keep your weapons up to speed for 40-ish years until they finally invade. So it's like, and of course, it talks about them having pots and pans, and pottery is like the way we detect ancient civilizations because that stuff does last in the ground for thousands and thousands of years. So yeah, all the claims, it's like, well, we wouldn't expect anything to find. It's like, yeah, you wouldn't expect anything to find if you have nothing but excusegetics for why you're not finding anything.
And I love these kind of points because I think we take too much at face value. It's kind of similar to the Noah's Ark one, which is like I've written about this quite extensively, which is why did otherwise sensible people believe ridiculous things? So how is it that someone that drives a car, works at a sciencey kind of place and lives their life pretty standard ways, right, then believes in Noah's Ark, the story of Noah's Ark, which is that would require more water than there are water molecules on Earth, that would require like you to just completely throw away your sense of rationality. And it's because so often we hear these stories when we're young, before we've developed enough knowledge to be able to question them, and they embed themselves in our psyche, and they're our stories, they're part of our cultural baggage. And then we get to the point where we learn enough about the world that we then start using our understanding and rationality to evaluate all these other stories, but the core ones are embedded already. And so quite often you're like, well, that's a ridiculous thing, I'm not going to believe that, that's a ridiculous thing, but you don't kind of question your own beliefs. I mean, John Loftus wrote about this in The Outsider Test for Faith, and I think it's a decent book, considering it's a very simple concept, which is, you should always be looking at your own faith as if you're an outsider to try and test it. And I think so often things get through the veto system because they're embedded when we're young. Not all the time.
Yeah. I mean, there's that bit of a theological bit prior to the Exodus, and the scenes, preparing the scene, the plagues and the killing of the firstborn of the Egyptians, and the bit of a magic show going on between the Egyptians and the Jews. It's a contest.
Actual magic.
Who's got the bigger snake? And the story persists to these days. It's been replaced by schlong rather than the snake. So measuring, literally measuring dicks at that point. Is that story before the Exodus? The ramping up of all these events. How do you see them, especially when it comes to the God's wisdom of killing the Egyptians' firstborn in order to soften the Pharaoh's heart? How do you see that?
Well, if he wants to soften Pharaoh's heart, he should have actually been staying his own hand, because the Bible says over and over again that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that way God has an excuse to do more showing off. So there's a whole section of our book about the morality of God, and I know Jonathan very much enjoyed writing that section.
Yeah, I mean, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, we won't really go into the details of that today. We're going to look more at historical anachronisms. But from a philosophical point of view, if you're going to put very explicit causal language where it says in the Bible, God did this so that happened. God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that this happened. I mean, the apologetics around that whole set of language, and it's repeated many times, the kind of hardening, is so, I think it's quite embarrassing from Christian apologists' point of views, because there is no getting away from, you wouldn't have that causal language unless either God wasn't sure what Pharaoh would do, in which case he's not omniscient. So I'm not sure. I think he might say no, but I really want him to say no. So I'm going to harden it just in case. Say Hanney is really doesn't like Jacob, right? Jacob's in this building, it's burning down. Jacob's going to escape down a fire escape, probably. You're not sure whether he's definitely going to come down the fire escape, but you lock it anyway, just so that and then the building burns down. You don't really know how Jacob died, but you have made sure that he was definitely going to die by making sure that he couldn't get out of the fire escape. Well, okay, so God's making sure that he's not quite sure, but he makes sure that Pharaoh is going to say no. Or the other option is God knows that Pharaoh's going to say yes and makes him say no, which then, so all of the plagues are contingent upon Pharaoh saying no. So the death of the firstborn, the death of cattle, gnats, boil, blood, all the horrors that those 10 plagues are, like the death of children, that's on God. That is, so God has brought that about. So it is, honestly, I spend a lot of time writing about this in the book, because it is absolutely horrific. God is a moral monster from that story alone. That story is enough for me to reject the Old Testament as being true.
And it's not far-fetched, because we can see that orchestration happening even from the scene of the original sin. There is a way God is trying to lead scenarios to be in a certain way. So otherwise, Jesus we're going to talk about Jesus in a different conversation, but his job description is that. And if the original sin never happened, then Jesus would have not been as important, probably. But let's go back to the.
Can I just to finish that idea off? The biggest problem for what I call omnigod, which is the classical God of classical theism, all powerful, all knowing, all loving. But if you add divine foreknowledge into that, that's the end of any coherent sense of God creating and free will, supposedly giving us free will, and all of the issues, I think, theologically with God in the Bible, or oftentimes any kind of God is if God has divine foreknowledge and creates anyway, I mean, it means it's just he knows that everything is going to come to pass, and that's what he wants to come to pass. So when you get, people from these horrific churches like celebrating at the funerals of dead American soldiers coming back or whatever, the Westboro Baptist Church or whatever, like they're actually justified in that because they are celebrating what God has planned and designed to come about. And yeah, so go and celebrate that because there's nothing greater than God, right? And God has brought that to be, and with intention. So divine foreknowledge is incredibly problematic for this more modern understanding of a loving kind of abstract God.
Actually, I would involve Aaron this one here because we might spend a couple of minutes and then go back to the literalism of the Bible, because I've actually used a bit of physics to solve that problem when it comes to omniscience, and the only way out, an intervening God is kaput. It doesn't work. But the A and B theory of time. So A is the arrow of time where we live. The asymmetry of time, it differs, and we feel the arrow of time. This is our realm, and it works well with general relativity. Time is relative, the observer effect, and all that sort of stuff. And then you have the block time or the block universe, where time exists. Past, present, and the future at the same time, but only one sort of entity can befit this particular model. Is mostly the God of Spinoza. It's a God that is not even aware that it exists. It's like a creator force. But what do you reckon, Aaron? Do you think an intervening Abrahamic God can fit that model, or the only way this would work is a creator who's not even aware of itself?
Yeah, one quick correction. The A theory of time is actually inconsistent with special relativity. That the B theory is the only time theory that actually fits with that, especially because in relativity, you don't have agreement on what the present is, simultaneity, and what the present moment is off.
Yeah, you're right.
Minor correction there on which is A versus B. Honestly, the labeling that was created at the early 20th century, it just sucks, because it's like, it tells you nothing. So poo-poo to that. But nonetheless, yeah, I would say that the A theory makes more sense on a being that isn't supposed to know the future, because on the B theory, basically every single moment exists equally. The future, the past, and the present all exist simultaneously, just like every cell in a piece of film exists for the whole movie that you're watching. The final scene exists even though you're only watching the very beginning of the opening credits. So if God is like that, he ought to already know the end because he exists at all moments. And that's a problem, to put it mildly.
The B theory of time posits block time, which is completely mutually exclusive with libertarian free will. So if you are someone that believes that we've got libertarian free will and you believe in kind of prevailing scientific understanding of time, then there's a problem there. And of course, if God's got full divine foreknowledge and you're relying on the B theory of time to allow for that, then you are precluding the existence of free will. So that's a problem not a problem for me, but that's a problem for many Christians.
Yeah. Speaking of the B theory, we should go to the B theory within the Bible about when this story is supposed to take place. See, that's how I do a transition.
Oh, nice. I like what you did there.
But one last thing about the science. Okay. Just the very last comment and last question. In the B theory of time, because one of the things that is very peculiar about the equations of physics, that they're all time symmetrical. It doesn't matter when you add the t in the equation. It doesn't matter whether it's sort of future leaning or past leaning. It's the same. Only in one sort of equations and laws of physics, when it comes to entropy and heat, there's always time is going forward. But apart from that, all equations don't care about whether it's a past or a future. They are symmetrical when it comes to that. That's why a lot of physicists tend to believe there is more to time than what we think we know. What do you reckon? Is there?
I need to put more time into thinking about time. It's also... And of course, a lot of physics is also suggesting that time isn't fundamental, that it can actually be derivative from more fundamental things in quantum field theory, that it could actually start from a completely space state where there wasn't a time dimension at all. So, time is complicated. I wish we had more time to talk about that, but we have another time issue to talk about at this time.
Yeah.
And that time problem
sure.
is, I mentioned...
He's so good, Aaron. He's just brilliant.
It's called coffee. That's how I get these things done. I mentioned the literalist dating of the Exodus. Then would put it basically in the 15th century, the 1400s BC. That's if you go and by say it's like 440 or 480 years before the construction of the Temple of Solomon. That's what First Kings would tell you. But if you look at some of the other internal clues to the story, it's going to make you scratch your head or your beard depending on what's most itchy at the time. For me, I have to do both. Let's take a look at some of the details of the enslavement of the Israelites while they were in Egypt. According to the story that the Pharaoh who comes in after the days of Abraham, after the days of Joseph, he isn't a friend of the Hebrews and he puts them into mass slavery and has them start building these towns of Pithom and Pi-Ramesses. And we know these towns from the archaeological record, not the least because one of them carries the name of a pharaoh. Pi-Ramesses literally means like the house or the temple of Ramesses. And we know exactly when there were pharaohs named Ramesses. Specifically, there was Ramesses I in the late 14th century, and Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, in Greek sometimes also called Ozymandias. And this is the most successful and probably one of the longest reigning, if not longest reigning, of the Egyptian pharaohs. He's on the throne for like 70 years. He has like over 100 kids. He was very productive, you could say. He built a gargantuan number of monuments. He had some relatively early successes in military stuff, such as the Battle of Kadesh, one of the earliest datable battles that we actually have like records of from both sides, actually, a little bit. So it's important that way. And again, we can tell this is the Ramesses who had the city of Pi-Ramesses built because we found the monuments, we can archaeologically date that, and we see that that's in the 13th century. That's when Ramesses ruled, that's when the archaeology points. So if the Israelites left...
13th century is 1200s
yes.
in just to remind people of how it works that way.
Yeah. Very good, very good. Yeah, so the thing is, if, according to the literalist reading of the Bible, the Israelites left in the 1400s, how could the Israelites then have also built a town in the 1200s if they had already left town 200 years prior? So there's already an indication in the biblical story that things aren't what they seem. There's another way you could also try to date things, because as you know, the Bible loves its genealogies. Begat, 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 begat. Now, most people will go from like the creation of the world, start with Adam, count up all the years, and then get to the Exodus time, and then forward, and then you get to Jesus. And there's plenty of problems when it comes to genealogies when it comes to Jesus, but we'll keep that aside for now. That's another question. Someone might have to write a book about that, wink, wink. But let's also run the genealogies backward, because we also have the genealogy for King David. And in the book of Ruth, for example, it also gives generations between David and one of his ancestors during the Exodus. Now, it doesn't give the number of years, but it does give basically the number of generations, and there are 5 generations between the Exodus period and David. Now, David is, at least according to the Bible, running around roughly around the year 1000, a little bit before that. So if we're talking about 1000, and there are 5 generations earlier that the Exodus took place, well, let's run the numbers. How long is a generation? Might say 20-ish years for another generation of humans to pop out. That's 100 years back.
Antiquity is about 20 to 25 years, something like that.
25 years,
yeah. So I'll just give like an upper and lower bound. If we take 20 as the lower bound, then that would say the Exodus happened about a century before King David, which would basically put the Exodus in the 1100s. That's not consistent with anything. If we instead say a generation is 40 years, which is really on the high end of things, that's still only about 200 years. So that would still only put the Exodus barely into the 1200s, and much later than what the other accounts of the Bible would suggest. So there are multiple indications on when the Exodus is supposed to be that aren't consistent, and this is the least of the acronyms that we have discovered in our research.
Yeah, so you've essentially got broadly two periods to date it, like the 15th century, so the 1400s, and the 13th century, so the 1200s. But obviously, you know, evidence for one is evidence against the other. But in the end, like, all the arguments against each other's dating fail, and there is just hugely problematic. But also, almost underpinning the issues with the biblical account for Exodus is this idea that Moses, and I think we need to kind of just sort this out first. The idea that Moses wrote all the Pentateuch, right, the first 5 books of the Bible, is just wrong for so many reasons, but it's still believed by some, like, traditional scholars. It is just absolutely untenable, not least because he wrote about his own death, and he's saying he's the most humble man in the world and all this, like, really. But also there is just so much evidence for some form of documentary hypothesis. So depending on, it doesn't really matter what theory you believe at the moment. It's just all the theories of that stand up much better compared to Moses writing the first 5 books on his own. All the theories are of multiple authors and multiple sources and redactors and editors, and they are, whatever the theory is just much more plausible and much more defensible and justifiable than the Mosaic authorship theory. And that we have to sort of talk an awful lot about the documentary hypothesis, the idea that you've got these 4 different sources, or maybe 3 different sources, or whatever, and then you've got redactors and editors. There is just so much evidence for this within the Bible that we have to spend quite a lot of time, you know, laying that out, because that then comes into explain anachronisms as well, because you'll have certain dating that makes sense from the Bible here, but then certain dating making sense from the Bible over here that's different dating. How can that be? Well, actually, that's explained by the fact that you've got one source proposing this and another source proposing that, and this is evidence of multiple sources, which is evidence against Moses writing the Bible.
I want to ask about the. I mean, every good story needs an antagonist, right? And Pharaoh is the antagonist here. Is the villain. It's the bad guy. The word Pharaoh, is it a name or a title? Because I looked it up in ancient Egyptian, and the word para, which the word Pharaoh comes from, doesn't even come to be a king's title until sort of the newish dynasties. So are they depicting Pharaoh as a name here or just a title?
They would know that a pharaoh is a title because there were pharaohs of Egypt until Caesar Augustus. So that would have been understood by any dating of the biblical text. But it is interesting that somehow we're supposed to believe that Moses wrote this book, that they knew the exact year that the Exodus took place, but they can't remember who was the pharaoh sitting on the throne when this whole story took place, that they only know him as king. And then the king said, da, da, da. It's like, he has a name. Why don't you know that? That is such a weird thing.
That is honestly not enough people bring this up, Aaron, which is the idea that this pharaoh is not named. It's just, that's such a weird thing. And I think that also is evidence, or it's kind of circumstantial evidence that this is not particularly accurate. Like, they're not going to pin it to a particular pharaoh. And actually, if they had done that, then I'd suggest that would have invalidated the story straight off, because, like, you'd be able to cross-check that easily. So they're being very sort of generic and vague, and
Imagine into the future they're talking about American history, and they just mention, and the president did that. I was like, what the hell? Which one?
yeah, exactly. So you've got these two datings, the 15th century and a 13th century. So 15th century, there are a few problems with that I'm sure Aaron can give you more detail on. Jericho and Ai were these cities that were not occupied at the time that they were supposedly conquered. So coming out of of Egypt into sort of Canaan, the idea is that, you know, they're coming to take these cities, Jericho and Ai, but they were not even occupied at the time. Egyptian dominance of Canaan was strong. So if you're supposed to be coming out of Egypt into Canaan in the kind of 15th century, actually Egypt controlled Canaan. So that's weird because the escape.
So you're saying that they haven't then exited. Then that's not an exit. Then they're still within the realm of the Egyptian control.
Oh yes,
exactly.
Yeah, it is probably the biggest anachronism of all. But I know Jonathan's on a roll.
Well, no, I was just going to say one more thing. There's no Egyptian collapse, no crisis or demographic shock in that time period as well. So when you're talking about all the plagues, those plagues, right, would, like, if you're destroying livestock and crops and you're having floods and or whatever, you know, all those things happening and you're killing firstborn, you just get mass killing people. That would be an absolutely catastrophic set of events that would have had demographic ramifications, and that would be, you would be recording that in history, you would know about that, but there's absolutely no evidence that there's some kind of demographic catastrophe that happens in that time period or any other time period. Anyway, sorry, Aaron.
Yeah, I want to especially highlight the level of anachronism when it comes to Jericho and Ai. So Jericho, with a famous story of the walls falling before Joshua blowing trumpets. So clearly the story takes place after the time of the Exodus. Now, we have been excavating at Jericho for over a century. There's been a lot of really good research. There's ongoing research as well to develop even more information about the site. But we have had a pretty darn strong consensus about when its famous walls did fall and what was the state of Jericho afterwards. The only thing that has changed from the 1950s is going from after the collapse of those walls of Jericho, there being no population, to after the collapse of those walls of Jericho, there was some pastoralists around. It was like, it went from Grand City to Shacksville, effectively. It would greatly diminish. And we can confidently date when this happened based on the methods of archaeology. And it took place at least a generation before when the Exodus was supposed to have taken place. So, whoopsies, Jericho had already collapsed before Joshua was even born, let alone leading military campaigns. So that's already an anachronism.
This is the early, and yeah, just to reiterate, this is the earlier dating as well. So this is a 15th century. So if you are advocating it happened in the 13th century, so the 1200s BCE, then it's even worse. You're out by, like, Jericho collapsed not just 20 years before, but like, you know, 320 years before. Anyway, sorry, or 220 years before.
Yeah, but that's peanuts compared to the issue with Ai, because we also have been excavating at the tell that Ai is identified with, and it was destroyed 1,000 years before the Exodus. So that's a gargantuan anachronism. In fact, the name kind of gives away that it knows it's an anachronism, because Ai in Hebrew means rubble. Do people call their town rubble pile? No, this is what you would see when it's just like this ruin left from the past, and you're now just calling it Rubble Town. So it's already indicating its anachronism there, and the fact that, yeah, Ai was destroyed roughly 1,000 years earlier definitely says Joshua didn't do it.
Were there any, when you're researching the topic, that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt? Or they were sort of, I mean, I think Egypt, I mean, it's fair to say a cosmopolitan place, maybe flourishing better than other spots on Earth. You would expect humans, we've always done that, go to a better place to live, you know. So I can completely understand there will be some people from different nationalities, from different places coming to Egypt to sort of have a better life. But were there ever any record? Obviously we've established the numbers, it can't be, because that's the exact number of the Egyptians themselves. So we're talking about a Jewish state within the Egyptian state, but were they slaves?
So, there is evidence that very minor levels of slavery were taking place. As you say, it's very common. There was a letter sent, I think, back to the Egyptian kind of command saying, hey, we've captured a couple of escaped Canaanites, what should we do with them at this outpost, right? And that's pretty normal. So yeah, okay, minor slavery, but like just completely as you would expect, as you kind of intimated. Just going back to the alternate dating, so in the 1200s, the 13th century, Egypt maintained very detailed military and economic records at this time of Ramesses II, and there is, as you suggest, no suggestion that there were any slaves, no suggestion of national catastrophe, no loss of military forces, and Canaan again was an Egyptian province, making like that conquest again implausible. So, but yeah, there is no evidence of mass Egyptian
systematic slavery. Yeah, so it's not systematic. It's like prisoner of wars. Whatever used to happen in antiquity is just the regular stuff.
There is a conflation that will happen, especially amongst apologists, that there is evidence that there were Asiatics, or even more specifically Semitic people in Egypt as slaves. That is definitely true, but that also has been true for centuries. And if we're talking specifically about Israelites, we can't just say there was a Semitic people group, because in the same way, the term Semitic is much wider than just Jews. Arabs are Semitic. They speak a Semitic language. People from the northern Levant, before there was in Israel, were Semitic. So it's a conflation on purpose to try to make the story sound plausible, when the fact of the matter is the evidence for any Israelite people group even existing in Egypt is null, let alone mass slavery. The earliest mention of any people group known as Israel comes from an Egyptian war monument from roughly 1208 BC. This is the famous Merneptah stele, and this is Merneptah coming into the Holy Land and basically, kicking ass, taking names, bringing back slaves and booty and things like that. And amongst the places or people groups that he beats up is a people group known as Israel. So we knew at that time there's a group that has that designator, but they're already living in the Holy Land. And apparently they're no match for the Egyptians, because they lose so badly that, according to the record that the Egyptians said, we basically said they don't even exist anymore. We kicked their asses so hard. Obviously, it's exaggerated, that sort of statement, because there was a people group known as Israel afterwards. But when you're trying to say, hey, there was this entire massive group of slaves there, and you can't even show that people group even existed at the time, you got a tall order trying to prove your claims.
Yeah, and there is an argument from silence here. So just to head people off at the pass, if they're going to say, arguments from silence don't work. Arguments from silence are valid and sound if you would expect there to be evidence. So, for example, if I say to you, my next door neighbor Doris, she's had a house had a house burgled, and you go in and you can't see any evidence for that. There's nothing immediately there. It doesn't disprove that it didn't happen. You might not know exactly what she had in the house, and it's a bit difficult. But there are certain times when arguments from silence are very, very strong. So, for example, if I got back off holiday and Doris told me, there was an earthquake yesterday, and it was 8 on the Richter scale, or whatever the new scale is for earthquakes, and there's cracks everywhere, and there's everything shook up, and it was a complete catastrophe yesterday. Oh my goodness, what an incredible earthquake. And I walk around the town, there's no broken windows, there's no chasms, there's no this, there's no that. And that is disconfirmatory evidence. That silence, lack of evidence, is confirmation that her claim is untrue, I would argue. And so arguments from silence can be really, really, really powerful if they're properly used. And so when we look at Egyptian, the Egyptian records were very, very good. I mean, Aaron will tell you more than me, but they had really good census records, slave registers, military inscriptions, administrative papyri, and the Exodus would have represented an economic collapse, a religious humiliation, a military disaster, all of these demographic catastrophes aforementioned. And if you see no evidence for that at all, then that is disconfirmatory evidence, I would argue. The lack of evidence is evidence.
Sometimes there's
that it didn't exist. If you expect there to be evidence and there is none, then that is disconfirmatory evidence.
Because we're not talking about God here as an entity that is supernatural, outside of space-time. We're talking about events that took place on Earth. So there should be some evidence, especially we're talking about a couple of generations in Sinai. 2 million people with their cattle. There were people born there. The people died there. They ate. They drank. You can argue that the confusion and being lost for 40 years, it could have been. I'm watching a TV series now called From. They're kind of oldish, but I love it because people are trapped within an area. It's like a pocket universe where they cannot exit, and they're being tortured in there. So what was with them being lost? Is it on purpose by God as a temporary punishment for something? How's that theologically explained in the Bible?
Not sure how best to answer that. Jonathan, what would you say?
I was just going to go off on one to talk about something quite different. I was just prepping up for my next point, so I was sorry, I didn't really catch all of that, because I was going to go big on talking about the exile. So like, sorry, I'm not answered your question at all, because I honestly didn't hear it quite enough. But something that we definitely need to establish is the importance of understanding when we think the Bible was written and why it was written, and then how that then helps to explain some of these anachronisms that we're talking about. So most scholars these days, certainly critical scholars, believe that actually what happened is the Jewish people went into exile, Babylonian exile, much later than these Exodus accounts, and that led to a good deal of, not everyone was in exile, but a good deal of the people were in exile in Babylonia, and they were looking for a sense of who they were, a sense of national identity at a time of crisis. And that arguably is when the Bible was developed as a kind of like national pamphlet, if you like, giving them a sense of national identity. And therefore they'll be drawing from the cultures around them, the Mesopotamian, Sumerian kind of myths that exist in the area that they've been exiled to. When you're starting to see some of these stories pop up in the Bible that actually originate from this area, you can understand that actually if the Bible was written in the exilic period or post-exilic period, then there are going to be these hallmarks left over in the biblical writing. And then you start seeing things like political assumptions reflecting Iron Age realities rather than Bronze Age Egypt, and the narrative reading much more as someone imagining what Egypt was like back then rather than knowing what it was like at the time. So you get this sense of writing in exile about somewhere 1,000 years previous, but imagining what Egypt was like. And actually that's what you get from the Bible. So one of the big anachronisms, I'm sure Aaron can tell us about, was, say, camels being used, or pitch being used on the side of Moses' basket, and his whole birth story appears to have been lifted directly from King Sargon of Akkad in Mesopotamia. But actually, these like camels didn't exist as domesticated animals at that time, and pitch wasn't used in that way at that time, but it was used 1,000 years later, right, or 700 years later. And so you've got this retrofitting of modern ideas and things back into these stories that you're writing of events that supposedly took place all this time ago, but you've got all these clues that actually is much later written in the exilic period or post.
So maybe let me ask a question maybe relevant to that. Do you think, given that this story is written after the events are supposed to have happened, is it a reflection or a psychological compensation for the Babylonian enslavement, and this is a society that is trying to establish itself as here we are, we conquered fear, we conquered defeat, and we came bigger and stronger to the 100%. Point where God, do you think that'll be the narrative?
I think you can't get away from the fact that the in my opinion, these Jewish people wrote the story of their existence while in slavery, talking about breaking free from bondage and slavery back in another time and place. Like for me, it's like, and when you understand that, these stories become so much more powerful, in my opinion. And this is what you would do if you looked at at a holy book in another culture, and you go, oh wow, look at how this relates to that, and it's a reflection of this, and you can see the connections, and we can use textual criticism, and we can there's this interconnectivity between these ideas, and these texts then become alive, rather than saying, right, I'm reading this and it has to be true, and it's true, and it doesn't matter. No, this is telling us about what these people were feeling in exile in Babylonia, arguably. So anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching this movie. It's a horror movie called the Exorcism of Emily Rose, where I think a girl has been abused by one of her relatives, and she didn't mean to, but eventually she had to create that persona where there's a devil and stuff like that to be able to live instead of going into insanity. And therefore you can completely understand that from a community point of view, that otherwise they go crazy, they go nuts. So they need something to give next generation some hope that out of fear and complete loss and defeat, there might be somebody who's emergent, who's a hero among us, who would actually see us to success and rise again as a people. And when you understand it in that context, it makes complete sense. It actually makes you sympathize with it, and you understand it from a human point of view. Unfortunately, this has been exaggerated, and this, instead of the hero of the story being the people who rise up after their defeat, the Abrahamic God takes over, and it becomes a narrative where he becomes the star of the show, even though he's done nothing other than it is just really.
And he's a classic hero. I mean, all the hero motifs are checked off here. Like Moses is your classic hero, and then when you look at Jesus, of course, so Jesus, as Matthew would have it in the Gospel of Matthew, is Jesus is a retelling of Moses. Then and then you could argue Moses has aspects of Sargon of Akkad. All of this is connected and all contingent upon what is essentially myth. I mean, Moses was myth, and if Jesus is supposed to be the retelling of Moses, and Moses is myth, then what's that say about Jesus? So I think it's really important. Aaron, did you have anything to say about camels?
I will get to that, but I want to also highlight that one of the ways we can also tell how much this story was influenced by the Babylonian exile is that we see that there was an Exodus tradition in the early Israelite prophets, but they don't have the story as we see it in the Pentateuch. Their idea, as best we can tell, because we actually see the change in verbiage they use between that and then later sources, and it sounds like they have this memory of the Holy Land being under domination by Egypt, and then they eventually are able to rise out of the ground and basically become a great fruitful plant again once they stop being stomped on by the Egyptians. So this was not an exodus coming out of Egypt, it's coming back out of the ground because we're not being trampled on anymore. And then the language changes once you have the exilic period, so you can actually see what they have done. They have had this older tradition, and then they have changed it and modified it to make it relevant to what was going on in that time. It's like, we now are taken away from our holy land, and we wish to be able to return, and using that previous time that God saved his people, but modifying it to talking about his return rather than just a regrowth metaphor. So it's very powerful in that way. And of course, if you're going to get back, you're going to need a ride. And if you think about riding through the desert, the image that comes to mind is the camel. If you watch pretty much any movie that's taking its place in the Middle East, there's somebody riding on a camel, there's a camel spitting, there's some sort of reference or joke relating to camels. And I have to be highlighting it because we know a lot about the domestication of camels and their relationship with Egypt, or lack thereof, we should say. The word camel itself is of Semitic origin. Most people would tell you it's of Arabic origin, though I believe the modern pronunciation is more like gamel. Hanney, you'll pronounce it much better than I will.
Yeah, Jamal in classical Arabic and Egyptian. It's very funny. The Egyptian dialect, we don't pronounce it as J sounds. We pronounce it like the way the Jews pronounce it, because they don't have that sound J. They have the ga. So we say gamal in Egyptian Arabic. So very similar to the Jewish.
Yes, and our word camel comes from gamel, and if you actually go back not to Egyptian Arabic, but the Egyptian language itself, and look at what the Egyptian word for camel is. It's gamel. They imported the word from the outside, so this was not a native thing to them. There were camels walking around Egypt, but not domesticated camels, and that did not happen until basically the 10th or 9th century BC. In other words, centuries after the Exodus time were camels actually domesticated, and then they didn't really become widely used in Egypt until basically after Alexander the Great, 1,000 years roughly after the Exodus time. And this is important because the camel shows up a couple different ways in the biblical story. One is with Abraham and, getting around by camel. Then it comes to how Joseph was taken to Egypt by Midian traders on camel. And then during the plagues, we are specifically told that camels in Egypt were being killed. And this doesn't make sense archaeologically because they hadn't been domesticated yet, and they weren't a part of Egyptian supply lines until much, much later. So they are at least anachronism of a couple centuries, and to be specific to Egypt and them being important, it's anachronism of a millennium. So it's an indication of how problematic the sources are.
But it's what you would expect if you were writing the stories in the exilic time and place and imagining back into what you would think Egypt was. And you're like, well, we've got camels now. So, of course, they had camels back then. So you include stories with camels. And we've got pitch here. So, of course, they're going to have baskets full of pitch covered in pitch there. And actually, that wasn't the case. So, anyway.
Yeah. The funny thing is because people associate camels with deserts, shape of the deserts and stuff like that. They actually the common ancestor of camels is actually from North America, around Canada and that area. So that's where they originate from. Not even the Middle East altogether.
Yeah, through Mongolia and those.
Yeah. Now, it is worth noting there is an apologetic attempt to get around this. So when we're talking about the domestication of the camel, we're talking specifically the dromedary camel, which is common in Arabia and such. But there is another kind of camel, more in Iran, Afghanistan, the Bactrian camel. Basically, what's the difference? One of them has one hump, the other one has two humps. That's the most basic difference you'll notice. And the Bactrian...
Quite furry.
Yeah, yes. And the Bactrian camel, it was domesticated much earlier, but we have no evidence that Bactrian camels were running around the Levant in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let alone the days of Moses. And we can tell because we have the bones. We can compare. And with the folks who have done the analysis, I definitely can't, but I've done that and looked at the bones. It's like, yeah, these are pretty much all dromedaries, or they're dromedaries, or we can't tell. There's no evidence of Bactrian camels in these ancient records, so that excuse just doesn't work. It's just completely forced to try to get around another very obvious anachronism.
And that's a 1,000-year anachronism. So it is or near enough. So it is a problem. Like any story that purports to be from 1200s to 1400s, including domesticated camels, is at least wrong.
Yeah, and it's a pattern because the Quran itself, there's a lot of suspicions actually written after when it was allegedly written or came down on Muhammad. Same with the Gospels, the four Gospels. There seems to be a repeating pattern of how myth is evolving. Anyway, I mean, myth evolves that way. It's written after some maybe. Events that maybe a bit similar, exaggerated highly, add some supernatural elements, add a god in the background, and there you go. You got yourself a religion.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a really good segue onto the birth story of Moses, which was, it ticks all the checks for the check boxes for mythology, for mythical tropes and whatnot, motifs. So you have this, again, go back to exilic period where you're in Babylonia, you understand about the birth of King Sargon of Akkad, who was a real person, right? But then had this kind of mythological birth story, as you often get with great figures. That story appears to be pretty much verbatim retold through Moses, where you both have infant hidden by the mother, basket sealed with pitch, set adrift in a river, which is kind of bizarre. Like if you want your kid to survive, why you would put it in a why you get a basket, cover it in pitch, and then whack that in a river full of crocodiles is like beyond me. But anyway, she wanted it to survive. Set it adrift in the river. It was rescued by the drawer of water, and this kid was raised to rule. Like both, they're the same stories, right? But for the Egyptian version to be, or the biblical version to be correct, it's kind of weird that you have this basket covered in pitch. And this is again one of these little things like camels, where you look at it and you say, but did they have pitch in the Egyptian area at the time of this story is supposed to have taken place? And no, they didn't. So I spent way too long in the book writing about whether or not it is realistic to think that they used pitch to waterproof, to caulk this. So you want to then be looking around. So okay, did pitch exist here, and did they caulk things with it? Did but in Egypt, what they do is they wad boats wood with like other stuff. They whacked it in, but they didn't caulk it with they didn't cover it in pitch to make it waterproof. And in fact, there's only like very small evidence that pitch was used either in trade or in terms of it was sort of used ceremonially in mummification processes and stuff like that. But there's no evidence at all that pitch was used. But however, back in the time when the King Sargon of Akkad story came to be, pitch was known to be a major thing in the Mesopotamian area, and it was actually famous for it, right? And so, you would expect there to be a story involving a pitch-covered basket from Mesopotamia, but you wouldn't expect it. And there are loads of apologetic attempts to argue that pitch was justifiable to believe that pitch was used in the Egyptian area at the time, but none of them work. And so I spend a lot of time going into just looking at this one detail and saying, actually, no, we should not be justified in believing that pitch was used here, and therefore it's much more likely this story was just lifted from a previous story where pitch was used.
Yeah. So my earlier question about why were the Jews lost for 40 years in Sinai, and me trying to understand it in a way that it wasn't really them being lost and being stupid. It was more of a temporary punishment by God for being horrible believers. Like they never really believed. Every time, imagine seeing all these miracles in front of you, the splitting of the sea, tables coming from the sky with food and stuff like that, and still Moses goes up to the mountain to receive the 10 commandments, and then here we go, the golden calf is being worshipped, and they go,
that's what it's about.
Here's your punishment.
All of the Old Testament is for me about moral codes, right? So you've got the covenant code, you've got the Decalogue, the 10 commandments, or 14, or however many, again, depends which source you read, right? But for me, like, it's all leading to all of these stories. Like you can map it out in Genesis, and it's all about kind of moral revelation, and it's about like giving you the laws. So these stories just lead up to, and here are the laws, and this is how you should live. And then you get these other situations where other laws are just thrown in as a reaction to how people were existing at the time. And you had is it Josiah or Jeconiah? Who was it? Josiah luckily finding some stuff in the temple wall, and then what I wanted were these rules. I've just found them in the temple rule, and now these are the rules. Because that's the rules you wanted, and there's nothing to do with God delivering them. But anyway, it's all about, like, for me, legal revelation. So that's the key. So the Exodus story arguably is about getting to the point where Moses can deliver the Mosaic laws, can have them delivered to him, and he delivers them to others.
Yeah. Do you see as well, there's a lot of people, especially Christians, when they argue for, because remember, Christians have a mission on their hand to reconcile the Old Testament God with the New Testament God. So they're saying, well, this is God's preparation of these people. These people were not ready to receive the Lord. They are harsh. They're horrible people. So I'm preparing you psychologically, and I'm softening you over the years. So what do you reckon?
It's almost like sometimes the Hebrew Bible is some of the most filled with some of the most anti-Semitic stories. It's like, these people are terrible. They're my people, but boy, oh boy, do I have to whip them into shape. And by whip them into shape, I mean torture them for generations. It's not exactly painting a kind image of the chosen people, to put it mildly.
But it's a real issue that I have with progressive revelation, which is the idea that we couldn't tell them slavery was bad then. We have to wait, till the 1800s or whatever, 17. It's like, no, people could understand. So what we do an awful lot in this book is look at legal codes, Uranumu, the Hammurabi codes, all these existing Hittite codes, moral codes that were written down that we know about, that were dated from this time, and then you get the Decalogue, and then you get the covenant codes. And what we should do as kind of historians or people who are interested in truth is look at the Bible in the context of the ancient Near East. Don't special plead it out of the ancient Near East and say, well, all of these ones are bollocks and this one is true, and I believe the Bible because I believe the Bible, right? It's saying, oh, I understand this as a moral progress through time from the Hittite codes and all these other codes. And you see the Bible takes these codes but then changes some of them, but it doesn't pop out of nowhere. This is a progress. So this should be understood in the context of the wider ancient Near East, and those legal codes, I think, are the points, really. The Bible is often better understood in how it changes stories. So when you have the Epic of Gilgamesh, right, having in, what is it, tablet 12 or tablet 13, it has its own flood myth, which essentially the Noah's flood is lifted from that, and you got verbatim the stuff to do with dove and raven, which is weird in the biblical account, but when you understand it from Gilgamesh, it makes sense, right? So yeah, oh, right, now I understand it makes sense. This is just a retelling of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But it's about, okay, they've taken this story, but what have they changed, right? And so what the Bible is often doing is revealing stuff in how it changes stories. So that is like, so the Epic of Gilgamesh was all about humans were making too much noise, and it was all like a bit weird as to why I think they got punished and you had a flood. Whereas in it's all about the sin, and is a different theology that takes place with the Noah's Ark flood, and that's what it's telling you. Then it's so often you need to look at the differences rather than concentrate on where the stories are the same. Anyway, sorry, going off on one.
Yeah, it makes completely, when you see it that way, it makes complete sense, and you can understand and actually appreciate it for what it was for the people that lived at the time, trying to make sense of things.
But yeah, sorry, I forgot my actual point I was trying to make, which is what really annoys me is when people say, oh, they weren't ready to understand that slavery is bad, so they had to go through all this like 2,000 years to get to a point where like, oh, now we understand that slavery is bad. That's rubbish. First of all, God could just go, slavery is bad. You might not understand why it's bad, but I'm going to tell you it's bad. Don't do it. And if you do it, I'm going to kill you. Right, then people know, okay, slavery is bad. I don't really understand why slavery is bad, but why we can't treat other human beings as animals. But anyway, God's told us. So A, God could have just given them that revealed law anyway. And B, you look at these other contemporaneous law codes, and they actually have better legal codes in some context than you see in the Bible. And this idea that, oh, they wouldn't have understood it yet. Well, actually, they understood slightly better things over there and over here. And so this idea that humans needed to wait X amount of time in order to be properly revealed moral codes is
I mean, we know that this is bullshit anyway, because divine command theory in sort of the schools of morality it doesn't require justification anyway. You do as you're told. There is no. I mean, don't eat pork. What's the justification for that? I mean, it doesn't chew its food. What the hell?
But you're right. So I forgot to talk about this. I mean, I've written about this heaps of times, which is divine command theory. So the idea, for those who don't know, is basically if God tells you something's wrong, then it's wrong because God told you it's wrong. But the thing, and so it's the idea that, whatever. Anyway, it's so problematic for so many reasons, not least because if it's not dependent on, the idea is they don't want moral reasoning to be the basis of what is right or wrong, because you don't really need God then, right? So it has to really come from God. So God's commands are what make it right. But then if that's the case, then you don't need moral reasoning. So there is no such thing as moral reasoning. There just is the commands from God. And then it's just, as you mentioned, it's just thoroughly problematic.
I mean, I would like to pose this question to Aaron, because it's such a good question. Imad is asking, why stories persist. We understand the condition of the olden days, and people didn't understand many things. Why do stories still consist even to the age of AI? It seems that stories and humans are linked somehow. And somebody said once, and I believe it, the story is truer than the truth. What do you think?
We are a storytelling species, and our understanding of how things are is at a narrative level, not a mechanical level. And you could even actually see that in some of the interesting Babylonian records in the following way. In the stories of Marduk, after he, saves the world, they give just this long list of all of his different names and titles. There's like dozens of such names. And it feels like, okay, why am I memorizing all this? And why would the Babylonian scholars waste their time doing this? They did that because they thought those names actually gave powers, that they thought that these names were not just titles to be memorized, but they actually told you something about the nature of reality itself. They fundamentally thought that the names of things gave them their essences, so you could control the universe with wordplay. And now I like my puns, but if I discovered that a dad joke could actually cause earthquakes, I would never open my mouth because of how scary that would be. But that's the kind of world that we had.
You would be drunk with power, mate. You would just be punning all over the place, going, ah!
But unfortunately, everyone else would have the same idea, and then everything would be earthquake. It'd just be... I would feel like I would have the same sort of power to turn this into a Marvel character, into... Thunderbolt. If he speaks, his voice just destroys everything. I'm forgetting which Marvel character that is right now.
Reminds me of
one with
Jericho. The sound of
yes.
the trumpet. There you go.
Yeah, there's an aspect to that, but this idea that the names of things shows to what extent that we really think at almost like a metaphysical level the narrative aspect of reality. So that just seems to be kind of how our brains are hardwired.
But it's about identity, isn't it? And I think particularly this is the case with the Bible. If you agree that it's written in the exilic period, then the reason that that I would posit that they were writing this is to search for a sense of national identity at a time when that was sorely missing because they were in exile and they didn't feel like they had some unifying kind of narrative. Here, then, you get a unifying narrative that brings together all of these elements and then brings you towards a kind of unified moral code that you can all ascribe to, and sense of culture and these rituals that, there's an awful lot of psychology done in looking at how the importance that ritual plays, and the Bible is full of ritual. And so this is all about community and bringing people together. And so I think that's why narrative exists.
You're right. That it's definitely a social aspect to it, because we tell stories not even just for our own personal stuff, but to have that sense of identity, and having those shared stories, those shared myths, gives them their ultimate power, no matter how true or false they might be. And if they are false, all the harder we have to believe them.
Yeah, I mean, you go to the Aboriginal Australians, for example, and they'll sit around a campfire telling you their stories of creation myths and this and that. And it's no different, just the fact that these have been written down and adapted over time. But you've got your creation myths, you've got your hero myths, you've got all sorts of, Moses is your hero here. He does magic. Him and his mate Aaron, they magic with their big long staffs. And you've got battles and you've got this and that. It is a set of myths and legends and stories, and to teach you and unify you and give you an identity.
I'm about to make a big claim. I claim that we should not lose our sense of storytelling at all, because from the same place where myth are spun and made, there comes the genius of man as well. Remember, Einstein was in the office in Zurich, the patents office in Zurich. Imagined the window cleaner going through a story of them falling and not feeling gravity underneath them and stuff like that. And it created a story and a narrative within its head. Newton's done that. Multiple geniuses have done that. Carl Sagan tried to communicate science through stories rather than just hard equations on a blackboard, and through the stories and his voice and narration was managed to communicate something that is evidently true. We're talking physics, we're talking important stuff here, but again through stories. So it seems to be very important to me.
Yes, because of stories, if I can make a correction, it was Black Bolt who's the one with his voice that just destroys everything. It's just so powerful.
Black Bolt.
Apologies for my mistake.
But
Like
this is really important. So when you go to talk about these stories that other people are telling, it's always about audience, purpose, task, right? So that your story, your task, your form, audience is dependent upon your audience, who you're speaking to, or who you're writing to, and your objective, your purpose. So is it to inform? Is it to educate? Is it to do this? Is it to do that? And when you have a simplistic thing like your story that Einstein was telling, I'm sure it's like, well, to get across to you this sense of X, right? Or that this is true, but I'm going to tell it through narrative form. The thing about the Bible is it's a collection of totally different genres that people misinterpret as history, right? So there might be historical elements of it in it later in maybe the Old Testament, but essentially you've got creation myths, but you've got poetry, but you've got legal codes, but you've got parable, but you've got this, but you got myth, and then you've got this, and then you've got propaganda, and actually the problem with the Bible is not a problem, but it's a problem if you think that this is a history book. Then you're just wrong straight away, because just look at the genres in there, right? If you're going to be literalist about the Bible, then you're starting off on the wrong foot. Like, it's obviously a collection of different genres written by a whole host of different people and then edited by a whole host of other different people, and so accuracy goes out the window. The question is, what's it trying to tell me? And by the way, the other really important thing, we talk about this in the book, is that we're not the audience, right? So the audience for all of these like pieces of text were contemporaneous to them being written or being told and then written down. So we're going to miss loads of the kind of references that are going on there and some of the wordplay that goes on, because we're not the audience. We're reading it in a third language it's been translated into, and where you're losing so much. So like these books and stories and texts, they should really mean less to us, and then we're just searching into them for more meaning or more truth than really there ever was.
To me, they're historical, though. They're historical, but they're not historical events. They actually reflect the history of the human mind. How we used to think. And so I think I don't like when people burn the Quran and the Bible. It's just, I mean, I can understand. I can, if they've been oppressed and stuff like that. But to me, these are treasures. This shows me how we used to think and what we used to do when we are faced with atrocities and horrible events and stuff like that. How did we survive? So to me, they are treasures of the ancient mind.
It's all right. There are quite a lot of Bibles and Qurans, so I wouldn't worry about a couple of them being burned. They're not disappearing. They're online. You can go and read them online. It's fine, in loads of languages as well.
So how do we progress the story from here? So we got to the situation Sinai. Then God had a confrontation with Moses. And Moses asked him, "What's your name? Because I don't want to go back to my people and to tell them who are you." What do you think of that particular scene with the burning bush and that little conversation between Moses and God?
Well, I think this is the story that we actually learned that the true God of the universe is Popeye, because he says, "I am what I am." And that's at least how I translate the Hebrew. There is a bit of pun on the name of Yahweh that it seems to have, or it likely has some relation to the verb ayah, so it means like to be, to exist. So when he's saying "I am that I am," is a play on words at the very least. The story itself, though, it is, one of the most, I would say, mystical parts of the story. And when it comes to the movie versions of it, the one that probably has the most interesting, mental impact to me is the Prince of Egypt, the animated film from the 90s, where I think, if memory serves, Moses is being voiced by Val Kilmer, and in that scene, the voice of God is also Val Kilmer. So it's basically, it's a voice in his head, but it's coming from the burning bush, and it's an amazing bit of scenery there, and some color because it's animated.
That's obviously before the real God appeared on the scene, which is Morgan Freeman.
True, very true. Yes, the one true God, yes. But there's been some interesting research to suggest where does this story come from and its origins, because there's a few things that are a bit weird. It's like, one, why is God coming in the form of a burning bush? Why is it that the bush is not burning? Why is it when the Moses get there, God first says like, hey, dude, take your shoes off. This is holy ground. It's like, what is with all this sort of stuff and this sort of ritual? And a expert in Iranian religion has been pointing out that the traditions here actually look like they're very strongly influenced by Zoroastrianism. It's not quite right to say it has fire worship, but there are these fire temples, and the flame is supposed to be extremely pure. The priests in that religion are even supposed to be covering their mouths so they can't even breathe into the fire. That's to what extent they need to keep the fire going and clean. And in the presence of that fire, the people working there, they are supposed to take their shoes off, that there's supposed to be this ritual with having bare feet for these sorts of things. And the idea that this is an existing god, like with past, present, and future, that is also associated with Ahura Mazda, the high holy god in Zoroastrianism. So this scholar is basically pointing out, hey, the tropes that we're finding here in the Moses story, they seem to be heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, which also indicates the lateness of it, because while the days of Zoroaster himself is very uncertain, we know when this religion was starting to become really widely spread across the ancient Near East into Egypt and places like that, and that's after the Babylonian exile, because it's the Persians, the Iranians, more or less. It's not exactly the same, the Iranians and Persians, but that general region of peoples there coming and destroying the Babylonian Empire, ending the exile for the Jews there, and then being under the powers of the Persians until Alexander the Great. So seeing Persian influence there only makes sense post-exilic period. So another indication of anachronism, but also seeing how interesting a mixture of cultures there is in this holy book.
Yeah. And there's another fantastic part of the story. So you've got Zipporah, Moses' wife. Moses is just about to be killed by God, isn't he, at one stage? And then Zipporah gets a flint and cuts off her son's penis, end of the penis, circumcises him, right? And then touches that to Moses' feet, which is supposed to be euphemism for his own genitals, I believe. And then God changes his mind. It's like, oh, that's a great idea. I'm glad you did that. I'm not going to kill Moses yet. Which is one of these bizarre stories. Like, I'm summarizing it very quickly here. But you just got this insane story where God is supposed to be omniscient, right, and have divine foreknowledge. So God can't change his mind. If God changes his mind, then God does not have infallible foreknowledge. I mean, I've written about this before. It's a standalone argument. So if God says, right, at 9:30 on Tuesday morning, I'm going to make a cup of tea, then if God doesn't make a cup of tea at 9:30 on Tuesday morning, his foreknowledge is fallible, right? So he actually has got it wrong. So therefore, God can never change his mind, and his own foreknowledge has to also exist in terms of his own actions. So God is a robot. God is a self-constrained robot because he knows his own future, and it can be no different to what he knows. Otherwise, he's not omniscient. Right. So in order to have infallible foreknowledge, he has to do everything that he knows he's going to do. So therefore, it can't be that God gets to a point where Zipporah cuts off the end of her son's penis, puts it at the feet of her husband, and then God goes, well, that's crazy. What a good idea. I'm going to change my mind and not kill Moses now, because then his foreknowledge is fallible. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
It's great. Some of these stories are absolutely insane. They're funny. Like, you sort of read them and it's like, what the hell?
So the question could always be, well, what was the intention of the author? Audience, purpose, task. So who's the audience? What was the purpose? And that's how you've written that story. So what was your purpose in this? What were you trying to tell? I mean, I don't know. But remember, and you've got this from if I got it there, God, the Stavropoulos' book.
God's Anatomy.
God's Anatomy. Yeah. So the idea that at this time God was very much a kind of human construct, but a human construct, right? We were very, very corporeal, okay? And it was, and you talked about this earlier, trying to reconcile the God of the Old Testament with modern religious ideals is really difficult, because the God of the Old Testament is someone that walks among people, that changes stuff up, that gets involved, that shows Moses's face, his arse, or whatever, all these kind of things involving God's body. And then the God we have now has no body, is an abstract idea, has no gender, is this thing that is just pure love. And you're like, well, okay, but then these two things, I often argue this, that they're just so incompatible. And so what you've had 2,000 years of people trying to reconcile a modern philosophical construction of God as that evolves through time, and then keep that making sense with these stories from the Old Testament that are just a completely different type of God.
Yeah, it's almost like God is playing keeping up with the Joneses type of situation. He's keeping up with the human evolution. The way we evolved is like, oh, now I'm going to be abstract, because the human mind has evolved. It's complex now, so I've got to match the complexity of the human mind.
In fact, can we talk about an interesting combination of God evolving and biblical anachronism?
That'd be great. Yes, please.
So, God is supposed to be the most powerful thing in the universe creating, crusher of the heads of dragons, all those sorts of things. But like most deities, they have a collection of stories that change over time, and our friend in the Bible seems to be the same kind of way. Now, here's the most interesting thing I'll show first as an anachronism, and then show that we got some development in the big guy. The Hebrew name, the Tetragrammaton, we have a little bit of uncertainty what the vowels are there, because the Masoretic text actually purposefully identifies the vowels in there. It uses the vowel points for Adonai in place of where we have the Tetragrammaton. So that's ultimately like how things get screwed up and eventually becomes Jehovah over a long process. But something like the name Yahweh. And we can find that kind of name in some Egyptian records in the 14th, 13th century, associated with a nomadic people known as the Shasu. But here's the thing that's a bit interesting. According to the Exodus story, Pharaoh knows the name of God. In the story, Pharaoh uses the name Yahweh multiple times, that he's supposed to know who Yahweh is. He knows the name of the God that's kicking his butt, or hardening his heart, if we want to use biblical language. But the thing is, in those Egyptian records, the Yahweh or Yahweh that they know of, that they associate with that people group, isn't a god. It's a place name. It seems to be a region. So the Shasu of this region called Yahweh. So in the days of the Exodus, the Egyptians know of a Yahweh or something like a Yahweh, but not at all even a deity, let alone the creator of the universe. And we don't see Yahweh as the name of a god until, confidently, the 10th century or so BC. So we have to wait a few centuries for this name to finally appear as the name of an actual deity rather than a region name. How that transition happened is really hard to tell because we don't have a lot of evidence, but we see a change.
So this is probably a good place to kind of steer it towards a conclusion, I guess, today, because, or I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm because there's quite a bit to talk about with regard to this, and we haven't done so. The plagues happened. Pharaoh very much understood that, as Aaron says, that God exists, right? Yahweh exists. I know I'm speaking to you. You've rained down all hell on my people. You've killed all sorts of people. You destroyed my army. And God did that to show his power. He admits this in the text. It's very obvious. So he does that to show his power and to essentially say to the Egyptian people, I'm God. I'm your God, right? And so if you were Egyptian, you'd be like, holy hell. What's just happened to my country? I've just lost my firstborn. My crops are dead, and I've got gnats all over the place. I've got boils and frogs just left, right, and center, and all my livestock, my livestock are dead, etc., etc. Like, this is horrendous, right? And I know what's happened here, and I know it's because of Yahweh, this God that I didn't really think existed, but now very clearly does exist and has spoken to my Pharaoh, and he's hardened his heart, and this has all happened, and as a result, all this chaos, right? What you would expect in reality if this happened is that all of Egypt would become Yahweh believers, right? But in reality, there's absolutely no evidence that anyone in Egypt was at all cognizant of this kind of religion, and until what was the year where we start seeing some Jewish diaspora communities existing in Egypt, like many hundreds of years later. I can't remember when it was, but you're like, it's just prima facie didn't happen this, because you would, again, it's an argument for silence, but a really good one. If God actually did all that stuff, you would expect God belief, therefore Yahweh belief, to exist in the place where he's done all of that crazy stuff. And there's absolute silence. There's no God belief. And then we can get onto the Amana letters. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I want to use that to follow up where I wanted to talk about the evolution of the character of Yahweh, that the Egyptians are supposed to be absolutely devastated by this god, but they don't even associate that name with the deity. They're that ignorant about it, even though somehow the pharaoh knows exactly who's doing this. So that's already super, super weird. But even our historical and biblical record shows that the God of the Bible at this time doesn't yet have the power to do what he needs to do. So let's fast forward to the earliest clear reference of Aaron. Yahweh. Yes.
Can you include this in your answer as well? How did Pharaoh know about the name Yahweh? Was he told by Moses the name, or he somehow sort of knew about him?
Yeah, if memory serves, that Moses uses the name, and then Pharaoh is using the name after Moses does. So,
there you go. Okay.
Yeah, so I believe that's how that. I think that's the direction. I have to triple check to make sure that there's at least that logical progression. That at least Moses used the name once.
So what I was referring to is not here an acknowledgement of the existence of that God. Is like, so you mentioned my God's name, and you mentioned, so your Allah is saying that. It doesn't mean that I really believe in that God even exists. I'm just referring to the name, because there's a conversation going here. So,
you've also got polytheism that leads to monolatry. So where you've got the belief that all of these gods existed, and actually just my God, my cultural little God here, is the one that I think supreme. But actually, it's not to say that these other gods don't exist. It's just my one's bigger than your one type thing. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah. It's I call it my milkshake is better than yours. You know that song?
Yeah. So let's talk about the first reference that we actually have to Yahweh as a god. And we actually have this from both sides of the story. This was a battle between the northern kingdom of Israel and the oh my goodness, it's not the Moabites, is it? The Edomites, sorry. And this is in the Meshech-Stele, where Israel is coming in and telling the folks there, hey, you're staying under our boot, and we're going to be using you for our tax collection purposes. And the god of the Edomites, Chemosh, is supposed to be their regional deity. And originally, Chemosh is just like, all right, you people are bad. I'm going to let you get your butts kicked by the Israelites for a while. But if you're good, I'll come back around. This is according to the Meshech-Stele itself, which was set up by King Mesha himself, the king of that region. And eventually, according to that story, Chemosh eventually decides that it's time to now protect his people again. They've learned their lesson. And we have this story from the Meshech-Stele and from 2 Kings that the Israelites are trying to come in. And there's this massive battle. The Israelites are winning, but then last minute, the king, King Mesha, sacrifices his son to Chemosh, and then the Israelites withdraw. In other words, this child sacrifice worked, and the only god that would work for is Chemosh. So what's going on here? God is losing a battle with another god, and not in Egypt, but just the nearby region. So Yahweh is so weak, he can't even defeat a local god. He doesn't have that power. He is just a completely regional being. And this doesn't change until the exilic period, where God needs to actually leave his place so that way he can go protect his people elsewhere. The theology in the 9th century BC doesn't even allow for the possibility that Yahweh can go to other countries and beat up their gods. So quite literally, Yahweh isn't the kind of God that can do what he does in the Exodus story until centuries later. So very much that God evolved. The best proof of evolution comes from religion itself, again and again.
but you also get this idea that Yahweh subsumes other gods, or either takes on the characteristics of those gods, or the stories that used to be for, say, Baal were co-opted to Yahweh. And so there's this evolution that as you move towards one god of many into the supreme god, and actually what you understood as these other gods really were actually part of Yahweh, or so Yahweh becomes this reinvented storm god, this Baal type god.
Yes.
But yeah, Mr. Jonathan, Islam is closer to reason and logic. What?
He's inviting you. He actually previously said you have a very, very nice smile. You sound like you have a really nice heart, and you're a loss. You need Islam in your heart, or else.
Well, I'm quite a moral character, right? I'm quite a moral person. Like, I'm really driven by my sense of morality in what I do on a daily basis, on how I exist. So on my geopolitical YouTube channel, I know my audience very recognize that my interpretation of global geopolitics is driven by my strong sense of morality and my sense of fairness. But I'm an atheist, right? And I can have a really, really solid, robust moral outlook that drives me on a daily basis, and I do not need God for that. And I know some people find that hard to believe, but this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, divine command theory. We don't need divine command theory. I don't need God to tell me what is good or right, especially when looking at the Bible and the Quran. I've read the Quran, and it is not, in my opinion, a very good sort of moral covenant, or a moral code, a set of moral codes. So I think that we're probably a lot better, a lot more successful at using moral philosophy to generate our own sense of morality and our own moral codes. And I think, and I'm happy with that. I certainly don't feel like I need God or I'm missing anything in my life.
Morality is a conversation among humans. We need to sort of reason them and understand why we're doing what we're doing. When God is telling you, why God? Because I said so. I mean,
it's an application of moral reasoning. That is anathema to me. It's like, something is only good if you can tell me why it's good.
Exactly right.
If you have no moral rational basis for saying I should do this or I should do that, then I'm going to just say, I'm sorry, no, you need to show me how that's morally justifiable. And that means that morality is a human endeavor involving human rationality.
Absolutely. I think we ought to do a broadcast just on morality, because I need to revisit, especially in the realm of biology and the game theory of John Nash's game theory, because it seems that we have no choice but to cooperate. If we don't cooperate, we all lose.
Yeah, as a social species, and you can look at different forms of morality in other animals and see, kind of evolution or convergent evolution of how, or
symbiosis.
Different ways that social animals approach. I mean, whether you call that morality or not, it depends how much they understand what they're doing. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion. But
a good conversation to have at some point.
Can we go to the Amarna letters, because I find the Amarna letters absolutely fascinating.
Go for it. By the way, we've got 20 more minutes, so
okay.
That's probably good. That's probably a good filler for them. Did you? I don't know, Aaron. Did you want to give an introduction to them, or?
Yeah, so the collection we have here is an amazing find. It's an accident of history that we have all these administrative letters from a time when Egypt was in complete control of the region we now call the Holy Land, Palestine. And this was during the religious reform period of Amenhotep, where he is coming in thinking, okay, we're now going to complete sun worship with the Aten. It's kind of sort of monotheistic, and poo-pooing the previous religion and the priesthoods of Egypt at that time. And there was a change of capital. This is where the city of Amarna is built. That's why they become known as the Amarna letters, because that's where the collection was kept. And then after Amenhotep and his dynasty ends, everyone's like, all right, well, we're done with that. And they just left behind the entire city of Amarna for archaeologists to come around many centuries later, dig that up, and find out all these letters back and forth between the pharaoh and the local governors in different parts of the Holy Land. So there was a king or governor of Megiddo, of Lachish, of Jerusalem, and we see all their petty squabbles with each other and telling, hey, Pharaoh, could you please help us out here? We love you so very much.
And what's interesting about them is they give us an insight into existing beliefs at the time, and they're not quite what we might have thought they were. So there was no conformity, it appears, as to how Judaism looked at the time. There was no following what we later come to understand as expected behavior. Have you got any details on that, Aaron?
So I should also put time-wise, this is roughly the 1300s. So we know time-wise. This also means, when it comes to our record, this would be after the time that the traditional Exodus would have happened. And the place being administered for the sake of Egypt is not consistent with a 15th century Exodus. So that's a problem. So it's also one of our good indications that there's no way the Exodus happened the century earlier, because the place is being administered by Egyptian vassal states. And
so yeah,
they are not
in the 14th century. So that means the 1300s, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So just one more piece of archaeological evidence that the traditional date just does not work. Kind of forcing you to say maybe the 13th century, which is at least a tiny bit more consistent with the whole Pi-Ramses being built, or P-Ramses being built. But there's still some other problems with that we can talk about perhaps at a later time. But you definitely don't get any sense from these letters that the people living there at that time are doing anything like following kosher laws. They definitely aren't talking about Sabbaths or Passovers. You're not seeing anything there that you would actually say is a central part of Judaism, as far as we can tell. It's pretty much just all quote unquote pagans talking to each other about who is the better follower of Pharaoh.
Wow. Well, these are very telling letters. Yeah.
There's no mention of any of the. Am I correct in saying there's no mention of any of the biblical kind of fathers and key founding figures of biblical history, which is absolutely which was what you would expect if the Bible hadn't yet been written, right? So the Torah hadn't been written. You would.
I think you're actually mixing that up with something a bit different, because the Amarna letters, that's 14th century BC, but I think you actually wanted to talk about.
Elephantine papyri, sorry, is what I was going to talk about. Elephantine papyri. But
all right, there's so many documents we have from Egypt. So when people say, well, we just haven't found it yet, it's like we have thousands of years of Egyptian records in huge archives, and we've been looking for any evidence related to the Exodus, and we're not finding it. It's not for a lack of looking.
So I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself. So the Amarna letters are really important, though, because they do invalidate the 15th century standard biblical dating of the Exodus, and it is very clear that the biblical narrative, just reading the letters, highlight the difference between a detailed historical record of the time, diplomatic correspondence, and the highly stylized theological narrative of the biblical text. This suggests that the biblical account of the conquest may be later, perhaps idealized literary construction that has served theological purposes for its writers, rather than strictly factual real-time historical record, which is exactly what you're saying. So the Amarna letters are a real problem, at least for one of the dating, which is the main dating.
And these letters sort of depict a very natural world, right? There's nothing supernatural about these writings. They talk about even mundane things like, workers at the side of the pyramids, what they've eaten, what the sort of foods, the beers and the bread, and so they seem to be. I tend to believe them because they're not talking about anything supernatural. They're talking about the organization of laborers, and therefore they seem to be close to historical as much as I can. I obviously doubt everything to a certain degree, but because they tend to talk about mundane things without any sort of leading towards the supernatural. I tend to think they are probably documented current affairs at the time of the Egyptian population.
Yeah, it's also worth noting the indifference of record, because like the Amarna letters or the Elephantine papyri, these are also what we would call primary sources. They're not like, a game of telephone of unknown origin. It's like, these are like, the artifacts of that time, or these are like, the autographs of those letters. There's not like, they're not copies of copies of copies of copies of copies centuries later. It's like, no, this is the originals found in the ground in situ in a historical or archaeological context that we can date. That is so much different than what we have with the biblical text, where we have, again, like we have things like the Masoretic text, and then we guess, well, maybe this is what it looked like in the 5th century BC. We can make educated guesses, but it's not the same thing as pulling it out of the ground from that time. But to focus on the Elephantine papyri, so
the Elephantine papyri are so freaking important. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. So these are a collection of, as the name suggests, papyri, but also there's a bunch of ostraca. Ostraca are basically bits of pottery with writing on them. And these are, very roughly 5th century BC. This is during the time when Egypt was actually controlled by the Persian Empire. It was under the Achaemenid Empire, which doesn't really end until Alexander the Great. And in these various sources, we learn about of Jews living in southern Egypt, basically on the southern border of Egypt, as mercenaries. Basically, it's a mercenary colony that was set up there by the Persians. Yeah, an outpost, yes. And among the letters and sources there, they're telling us about a bit of the activities and some of the struggles there. And things that we learn about is apparently there is a temple to Yahweh in Egypt, in southern Egypt, which already should be ringing alarm bells. It's like, wait, I thought there's supposed to be only one temple for Jews, and it's supposed to be the one in Jerusalem. What's going on here? That's a problem. We see that apparently at this temple they have worship to Yahweh as well as several other gods with Semitic names. So there isn't anything like monotheism. There are ostraca that indicate that there are priestesses operating in this temple. So we definitely don't have the priesthood of Aaron running the show there, because we have ladies there, not sons of Aaron running the show. We have communication between that temple and the one back in Jerusalem. So not only is it the case that these are just Jews that have lost their way, as somebody might say, it's like, no, they are in communication with the homeland and in coordination with them, and there's no letter running back and saying, you heathens, you heretics. It's just like, no, it's just more Jewish community.
And there's evidence, is there not, of them praying to Yahoo and Asherah? Like, so that there's the consort of God as well, which would be anathema to later Jews, right? So you've got polytheism existing here. So almost this idea of what we were talking about earlier, monolatry, of like supreme God among many, but it's not the one God. It's about all of these different, also showing different religious law as well. So they don't adhere to religious law in a way that, if you read the Bible as if it was written back, so Moses was writing a book back in 1400s BCE or 1200s BCE. Now we're looking at a 100-year span between the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, and you've got these Jewish people leading completely like one might say erroneous Jewish lives, praying to all sorts of wrong people, doing or gods doing all sorts of wrong religious ritualistic things, and this not being a problem. This is just like, that's how it was. In other words, there was no conformity yet in terms of religious belief, and that comes a lot later. And that's where you start saying, okay, the exilic period of writing the Bible and actually getting some kind of uniformity going on here is then again much more plausible, and at least somewhat is not disconfirmed by this. And I'd say it's evident by this.
Yeah, if anything, it adds to the evidence that there may be stories that have existed in the exilic period, but they really only start becoming normative well into the post-exilic period. And we don't actually see, for example, the adhering to the laws of the Torah en masse until the 2nd century BC, during basically the Maccabean period. Before that, we just don't have in the archaeological record evidence of the avoidance of scaleless fish or anything like that, as far as we can tell, it's only in the 2nd century that we see actual evidence of Judaism writ large, which is pretty amazing.
I was confusing myself. So the exilic period obviously fits alongside this, and you haven't got, although you got the writing of maybe arguably the Bible, it's getting compiled, but you have no kind of. It takes hundreds of years for that to then filter through to be, which is what Aaron was just saying, some kind of like set of prescribed moral codes, right, that people uniformly adhere to. So in the Elephantine papyri, you've got evidence of female priesthood as well, like, which is that's surely weird for Judaism, but of course it just shows you that they're not even the language is Aramaic, I think, of the letters as well, which is possibly different to what you might think. So the Elephantine papyri, I honestly think, are one of the most fascinating and interesting elements to really trying to well, not that you want to try and prove that the Bible is not this or it's not that or whatever, but like, for me as a skeptic, I think that this is a really huge piece of evidence to suggest that our traditional understanding of the Bible is just very, very wrong.
Yeah, and it also shows the continuation and the common ancestry between paganism and Judaism. So it wasn't just a point of time where everything was divorced from paganism and here's a new covenant starting. It was actually sort of a continuation from that, and it sort of faded away over time for the patriarchal to take over eventually.
You're absolutely right. So part of the Elephantine papyri and part of what they show us is that there were these syncretistic practices. So syncretism is where you kind of take on an element of another religion. So Easter, for example, we talk about Easter, but that comes from a pagan god Oestre, right? And it's all about like new life and that spring equinox or whatever. And so, if you're a Christian, you say, right, we want our religion to take hold. Well, let's use what's already there in the foundations of these other religious beliefs in the places that we're going to, and then use that. Say, okay, you believe this, you don't want to get rid of that. Okay, well, we're just put on top of that our sense of what Easter is, or our sense of new life with Jesus rising from the dead, etc., etc. So syncretistic practices are very commonplace, and actually the Elephantine papyri also show that with regard to other gods that then get subsumed, as we talked about, into Yahweh eventually.
Yeah. I mean, sacrifice is a pagan, was practiced sort of commonly in paganism, but it never really faded away. Even in Christianity, it's sort of the theme still follows. You have to have a sacrifice. It's almost like blood magic. You cannot sort of remove a sin without the shedding of blood. It seems to be that even the one true God is still continue the tradition of, I want to see blood, I want to smell barbecue.
The idea of smelling burnt sacrifices and it smelt good is just, again, this goes back to this real human corporeal understanding of what God was at that time. And like the idea that God would smell a sacrifice and go, yeah, that's what I want. That's an awesome smell. I like that. Is weird for the modern believer, right? And that's what I talk about. Like trying to marry these two types of God to get together it's impossible.
Funny enough, even the ancients knew that was a weird thing, because how familiar are you guys with ancient Greek playwrights? Because Aristophanes' story, The Birds, has that sort of thing where the birds basically gang up and prevent the smell of the sacrifices reaching the gods on Mount Olympus, and then the gods becoming all weak and sickly because they're not getting their good smells anymore. So I think even the ancients knew this is weird shit.
God wasn't getting his fix.
Yep.
But it's so weird. I mean, I wrote a book where I look at all these sorts of arguments. It's one of my favorite books. It's a really easy to read book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design, which is forward by Dan Barker, the great Dan Barker. But these arguments that look at God's omni characteristics and then try and make sense of, like, well, okay, you're saying this is true, you're saying this is true, but then how does that work? The ideas of like God, if God's ontologically perfect, if he exists utterly perfect as this being, as many believers would suggest, then he has no needs, no desires, because that's a weakness. You shouldn't have a need to do anything, because that's not perfection. If I'm I don't have needs because I'm already perfect. So why create everything? Why degrade ontological perfection by creating where creation is necessarily a degradation of ontological perfection? And so, all these sorts of arguments where you're like, well, if you believe in this perfect God, he wouldn't actually create anything in the first place. And if he does, he knows what's going to happen. So he's punishing people for doing what he knew they were going to do anyway. And he created them so that they would do it anyway. And it just goes on and on and on, where you're like, none of this makes sense. So you can invite me to Mecca, you can invite me to Medina, you can argue that I should read more into the Hadith or the Quran, but honestly, none of it makes any sense. Philosophically, the idea of this kind of God is just massively incoherent, and I'll stick with this. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think so one of the things that we probably tell the people that are watching us at the moment on both YouTube and TikTok, the three of us are going to start a collaboration program, and hopefully by that time, Jonathan, how's your TikTok account, by the way? Are you still unable to?
Mate, I've been so busy. Like, I'm doing geopolitical stuff here, and when people like Donald Trump just don't stop saying crazy things, like, I'm just super busy. I'm just reacting to the insanity that is the world. I was invading Greenland now. Okay, right. So I'm just super busy. So, like, once it calms down a bit, I'll be all over the TikToks.
Yeah, because the interaction on TikTok is brilliant, and people will be able to come up and ask questions and stuff like that. So hopefully in a couple of weeks, when we have our next conversation, we've discussed the idea about philosophy and science, and are they working together, or philosophy has completely been buried and ended by science?
Science is philosophy.
That's what I think. But a lot of the Arabic atheists believe.
We just answered it.
Yeah, but they want reasons why, these are very skeptic communities, so we got to tell them why we think that's the case. Plus, I would like to discuss your books at length, guys, as well. So we probably should have a monthly pub chat of current affairs, and TikTok, I think, provides the perfect platform for that, because I found over the last few months, the interaction I get from young people who are maybe on the fence, they are religious still, but they feel something isn't right, and they're quite critical in their thinking. And I think we can do really a world of good if we can actually help younger generation, give them just the tools of how to think critically. I think we will be doing ourselves a favor. So let's sort of pulling the strength of this conversation together, and I'll start with you, Aaron. Maybe some final words on the book, and when is it going to be released, by the way? Do we have a release date?
That's down to me. That's down to me editing.
Yeah, and it's also down to me learning how to write better, so Jonathan doesn't have to constantly pull his hair out seeing what I wrote. There's a lot of learning on my end about how to English good. So, I mean, if we were somehow hyper productive, we would have things out for Passover time, but we're not going to probably be that lucky. But we are absolutely going to shoot for this year. Let's promise that much.
100%. Yeah, and I'm picking up the pace of my editing. So yeah. It's just almost relearning all of this as I go. I mean, we did an absolute ton of research, and and it's so varied as well, because we're talking about like moral codes over here and things like the Lipa Ishtar and Uranumu codes and Hittite codes, and how that relates to the covenant codes. And then over here we're talking about the philosophy of God hardening hearts, and then over here Amana letters, Elephantine papyri, and then it's just so multifaceted, which makes it a really fascinating book.
Yeah, and it's just it reminded me of there was a scene from Bowfinger, which is a movie by Eddie Murphy. He was an actor, and he was complaining about all the foreign actors taking over Hollywood and taking all the nice scripts. And he said, and Jackie Chan and Van Damme, and they can't even speak English good.
I also have to be careful, because I've actually had foreigners correct my English. So, and I mean that literally. I've actually my old German girlfriend noticed I was saying certain English words wrong. So I've learned the hard way how much I have to learn. But when it comes to learning, not only has this been an absolute wonderful experience of digging in all these things, but it has led to a lot of new additional scholarship along the way as well. That besides this book, there are several different articles that have been published or are in review right now. Thanks to the work that happened here. So this is going to be not just an atheist screed. This is going to actually be contributing to scholarship and moving the ball forward.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool.
That is fantastic. Well, Jonathan, you got any final words today?
Yeah, just I think if you want an accurate understanding of the world, right, which I think should be what we all strive for, having a greater sense of reality, then we need to look at all of our of our holy books, of our history and culture, and try and unpick it to get to what were the intentions, what's the truth, how do we understand reality. And I think for Christianity, I think you've got those three pillars of the nativity, the resurrection, and the Exodus accounts. And these are the three areas that most intersect with, I think, history in the Bible, in the Christian Bible as a whole. And I think they're left seriously wanting. And if you don't have a reliable if you don't have a justification for believing the resurrection historically happened as the way reported, and the nativity and the Exodus, then what are you left with? And I think these really do unravel Christian and Jewish belief.
I'm just first going to end the conversation on TikTok and say goodbye to the TikTok audience. So that is gone, but then we're gonna also say goodbye to our YouTube folks. All right. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Aaron, and we will be in touch over the next few days to arrange for our next conversation. I hope people enjoyed the conversation, and there will be more. And I want to talk about politics at some point. So I'm not going to put my head in the sand because there's so much to talk about, and I think we should not be silent against what seems to be a very dangerous situation, in my opinion, at the moment.
Yeah, it's applied philosophy, so that sounds good to me.
Fantastic. Well, have a wonderful day, folks, and have a wonderful day, Jonathan and Aaron. See you guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.